Good afternoon. My name is Donald Morrison. I'm a member of the Department of Philosophy and also the Department of Classical Studies, and I direct the Rice University Lecture Series on Ethics, Politics, and Society. The lecture series is sponsored by the Dean of Humanities and the Baker Institute. On behalf of everybody involved, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to each of you. Thank you for coming. No matter how distinguished our speakers are, ultimately the success of a series like this depends on your interest and participation. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Thomas Pogge. Maybe I can in some way date the two of us by mentioning something he may not remember. When I was a first-year assistant professor, he was responsible for the first invitation I ever got to speak at another university. He is Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs at Yale University. He is also Research Director at the Center for the Study of Mind in Nature at the University of Oslo. He is a wide-ranging and prolific philosopher. He has written 2 books on John Rawls. He's done important work on Kant's moral and political philosophy. And he is an absolutely central figure in the current philosophical debates on global justice. In fact, he's rather global himself. He's a native German, Harvard PhD, and a member of the Norwegian Academy of Sciences. He's been involved since 2006 on research projects funded by the Australian Research Council. His website tells us that he has lectured in 41 countries and taught 26 graduate seminars abroad. Over the last decade or so, Thomas Pogge has written and lectured especially on justice in healthcare, often from an international perspective. And that is what he will talk to us about today. I give you Thomas Pogge.
Good. Thanks, Don. Thanks very much. And let me reiterate, the important part of this event is you and not me. So get prepared, ask good questions, and psych up for it. All right. So I will begin with a little bit of background about global health and, in particular, how poverty contributes to the global health problems that we face in the world today. These are some of the poverty-related deprivations that people suffer and that contribute very greatly to explaining the very large global health problems of the world today. So you have roughly 6.8 billion people in the world, and as you can see here, many of them still suffer from very basic deprivations. They don't have enough to eat, not just sometimes, but pretty much every day. They don't have access to essential drugs. They don't have access to safe drinking water, to adequate shelter, to electricity, sanitation, to basic education. They don't know how to read and write. Many children from a very early age do work outside their household for wages, often bonded labor, where the parents have to give up one of their children to pay for a debt. One interesting tidbit about the first of these items, the just over 1 billion chronically undernourished people, you may be surprised to hear it's the first time in human history that figure has crossed above 1 billion, and that just happened last June. So we now have, for the first time ever, more than 1 billion people who don't have enough to eat each and every day. Now, these deprivations, severe as they are, of course, also cause early deaths. A lot of people die prematurely because of poverty-related deprivations. Now, that number is difficult to estimate, but one good way to get at least an initial handle on it is by looking at certain causes that really affect only poor people. Pretty much nobody dies of those things in wealthy countries. And then look how many people actually do die from those causes. And that gets you to about 30% of all deaths in the world, each day, each week, each year. 18 million each year, 50,000 each day, and I've put those causes on the board. Now, of course, that's in many ways an understatement, because there are also causes from which we also die, from which poor people often die much earlier, or we recover from an incidence of cancer or diabetes or AIDS or something where poor people die. So at least I think 30% of all human deaths are due to poverty-related causes. If you take this conservative estimate and look at how many people died from poverty-related causes since the end of the Cold War, you get to somewhere around 350 million deaths. And that's a large number even in comparison with the great disasters of the 20th century, such as the Second World War, which killed, in scare quotes, only 60 million people. It's a very large number. That includes, by the way, the extermination camps, the gulags, and so on. Altogether, just 60. Here with poverty, we do that essentially every 3 or 4 years or so. The total number of government-sponsored violence deaths during the 20th century was about 200 million. Now, that raises, of course, moral issues, right? If so many people suffer so severely, die early, and so on, that is a moral problem which we ought to be thinking about, and I think a lot more than we actually are thinking about the problem. And one way we might approach it is through the language of human rights. We have a pretty limited catalog of human rights laid down first in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and later in 2 covenants in 1966. And in the Universal Declaration, that proud document of 1948, we find this as Article 25. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of oneself and one's family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, necessary social services, and so on. And very, very large numbers of people are short that human right, not just temporarily, but chronically, permanently. So that's a little bit about the background of that global health disaster that we face pretty much each and every day, even though we find it in the media only on special occasions, such as this one now with Haiti. Now, let's talk a little bit about the economic magnitude of the poverty problem. You probably thought this is a little bigger than I had thought. And so you probably expect that the economic magnitude of the poverty problem will also be quite humongous. So look at this chart here. The World Bank has an official poverty line, and that poverty line is $1.25 per person per day in 2005 currency. So if you lived in 2005, most of you did, and if you had over $1.25 per day, then you're not poor. That $1.25 covers food, drink, clothing, shelter, medical care, education, absolutely all expenses. So that's how the World Bank defines poverty and counts by that standard 1.38 billion poor people. I should say they convert at purchasing power parity, so the exchange rate here is irrelevant. They give credit to the fact that prices are often lower in poor countries. That's already worked in there. So when I say $1.25, I really mean $1.25. Now, the World Bank also keeps statistics on higher poverty lines, such as the $2 a day purchasing power parity 2005 line and the $2.50 line. And obviously, as you raise the poverty line, you find there are more poor people, and the average shortfall of these poor people from their poverty line also increases. Now look at the second to last column, and you see what the total poverty gap, what all the poor people relative to a particular line are missing relative to that line, what that comes to. And amazingly, if you take the $1.25 poverty line, the total shortfall of all poor people together is just 1/600th, 0.17% of world income. So it's extremely small. And even if you raise the poverty line to $2.50 PPP, the shortfall is still only 1.13%. So the economics of the poverty problem, surprisingly, are that it's extremely small. It's a very small problem. In the rightmost column, you see it in billions of dollars. And relative to the $2.50 poverty line, the total shortfall of all poor people, almost half the world's population, is just $500 billion annually. And that's just about the US defense budget. If you had honest accounting with the US defense budget, it would be a little larger. But, they do it creatively, as we all do on occasion. Okay, so these two things are the first two things for you to remember. The global poverty problem is much larger than you thought in human terms and much smaller than you thought in economic terms. Now, it is so small in economic terms because inequality in the world has grown to such enormous proportions. It's growing all the time, and it's grown tremendously. I will show you later a few figures about income distribution, but here is just a pie chart about global wealth distribution. Global wealth distribution, basically that big black thing you see on the left, that's the top 1% of human beings in terms of wealth. They're 40% of all wealth. This is the year 2000. It's become a lot more unequal since then. That tiny little baby blue sliver, 1.9% at the top there, that's 60% of the world's population, the bottom 60%. 2% of global wealth is held by just 1,100 billionaires. So it's extremely unequally distributed. And that accounts for the fact, of course, that a problem that in human terms is so large can be in economic terms so small. Now, you will say, well, we are doing a lot about poverty, aren't we? We are fighting poverty left and right and trying to do what we can to reduce it. And the big flagship effort that we are making is the Millennium Development Goals. So I want to talk with you a little bit about those Millennium Development Goals and what they are like. This is the statistic that you find often in the media. You find it's published by the World Bank and so on. That tells you how we are doing with regard to MDG 1, the first Millennium Development Goal, which says that we will halve the number of people living in poverty as defined by the World Bank through $1.25 a day, and that we will also halve the number of people suffering from hunger. Well, with hunger, I've already told you, unfortunately, we are moving in the wrong direction. We've reached a new all-time record in 2009. But with regard to poverty, the World Bank has good news for us. These are the percentages of people living in poverty in the developing world. And you can see that in 1990, that percentage was 41.6%. In 2005, it had already dropped to 25.2%. So we are not only well on our way, we are actually overachieving the goal, which was to halve that percentage between 1990 and 2015. So basically get it down to 20.8. And looking at the present trend, we are ahead of schedule, actually 40% ahead of schedule, and doing pretty well, thank you very much. Now, the reality check I already gave you, the number of people who are hungry is higher than ever before. And so you wonder, what is going on? What gives? Are they miscounting the number of poor? Are they miscounting the number of hungry people, or what? Here's an interesting way of approaching that question. As I told you, the World Bank has 4 different poverty lines that they maintain, all denominated in 2005 dollars, converted at purchasing power parity. And I've given here the statistics that the World Bank is publishing about various periods, figuring out how much success we had in getting poverty down over those respective periods. Now, if you look closely or not so closely, you'll see immediately one regularity. If you go down any column, you find that the result gets worse and worse as you go down. In other words, the higher you set the poverty line, the worse the trend looks. That's true not just for any one period, it's true for absolutely every period across the board. It's a perfectly regular statistic. And so the World Bank gets reasonably good numbers thanks to the fact that it uses a very low poverty line. You can see here that the relevant period for the MDG, number 1, is the period 1990 to 2015. There we were supposed to get a 27% reduction in the number of poor people, which requires a 17.2% reduction to be just on track by 2005. Now, how are we doing relative to that 17.2% reduction in the number of poor people? Well, it depends on how high or low you set the poverty line. If you set it at $1 a day, you are doing very well. You are 86% ahead of target. You have achieved a 32% reduction. If you do it in terms of $1.25, we are 40% ahead of target. If you do it in terms of $2, well, we are 59% behind target. And if you do it in terms of $2.50, well, then actually we went backwards. There are more poor people relative to that poverty line now than there were in 1990. Now, I should also say that, in case you hadn't noticed that $1.25 is, objectively speaking, a very low poverty line, even if you want to concede that poor people should really only have the absolute minimum. The US Department of Agriculture publishes a very nice booklet for very poor people telling them what to buy in order to get through on a minimal diet. They call it a diet for short-term or emergency use. And the cost of that diet, it depends a little bit on family size and age of children, but it's somewhere between the upper threes and $4.50. So that's what the US Department of Agriculture thinks is the low-cost emergency diet in this country. Remember, we are converting at purchasing power parity, so don't think that money buys more in poor countries or anything like that. And also remember that, of course, we don't live just from food alone. We also need drink, we need shelter, we need clothing, we need medical care, and so on. So the World Bank says $1.25 is all you need, which today in 2009 would come to $500 per person per year. Here's another interesting tidbit. That is that the poverty line that the World Bank has used has been updated, as they call it, repeatedly. They've changed the poverty line repeatedly to bring it forward to a later base year in which they do the purchasing power parity conversions. So the method always is you take a particular amount in the local currency of some other country, you use the local CPI, Consumer Price Index, of that other country to convert it into the base year, which now is 2005. You then use the purchasing power parity for that currency to convert it into US dollars, and then you compare it to the poverty line of $1.25. So if you do that with the three different base years that the World Bank has used in consecutively, you find that there is a clear trend that the poverty line has actually gotten lower and lower. So if you ask yourself, how much money can I maximally have to count as poor in the United States today, then the answer would have been, well, $2.03 per day on the initial poverty line introduced in 1990, which was denominated in 1985 PPP dollars, and so on down as you see it here in that chart. So today the answer is the maximum you can have is $9.59 per week, $500 per year. If you have any more than that, you're not poor. Now, the making of the MDGs. There's one thing that's important to know. The MDGs, they have a history. They didn't come out of nowhere. And the most immediate history of the MDGs is the Millennium Declaration, which was passed by the General Assembly of the United Nations in September of the year 2000. Now, if you compare the Millennium Declaration as it was passed by the UN with the MDGs as they are now being tracked by the United Nations on their website, in their annual reports and so on, you find that there's an interesting discrepancy in the text. The discrepancy is with regard to the base year. If you look at the entire Millennium Declaration as passed by the General Assembly, the word 1990 never occurs there. There's always talk about the present. We are trying to halve poverty from the present time, 2000 to 2015. But the MDGs are formulated in terms of 1990, as you can see here on the board. So sometime between 2000 and late 2001, the MDGs were formulated in a way that deliberately falsifies the text of the General Assembly Declaration and backdates the baseline to 1990, which of course was a higher level in many cases and therefore reduces the ambitiousness of the MDGs. Now, I know this is a sad topic, but here is the humorous highlight of this lecture. Kofi Annan in the year 2000 is giving the first report of how are we doing with regard to the MDGs, which he had just helped reformulate from the Millennium Declaration. And he said, well, we had 28% poverty in East Asia and the Pacific, the world's most populous region in 1990. So the goal for 2015 is to bring it down to 14. And lo and behold, in 1999, we already had reached 14, a year before we announced the MDGs, or at least the Millennium Declaration. So this is, of course, because China, during that period, had a spectacular success in reducing the number of poor, according to current statistics, by 265 million people. And one big reason to backdate the baseline was that we wanted to take advantage and count those reductions towards MDG 1, if we can. Why not? Let's not let these poor people go to waste. Now, the Millennium Declaration passed by the United Nations is not the first promise, but rather there was a still earlier promise, which was made in 1996, again with great fanfare and media circus in Rome, the capital of good old Italy. And there, 186 governments came together and promised to halve the number of extremely poor people between 1996, which was the present time, and 2015. Now, here is another subtle change, namely that both the Millennium Declaration and the MDGs are formulated in terms of a proportion, whereas the initial promise of 1996 is formulated in terms of a number. The difference is clear to all of you. A proportion is a ratio with something in the numerator, the number of poor, and something else in the denominator, the number of the world's population in case of the Millennium Declaration, or the faster growing population of the developing countries in the case of the later formulation of the MDGs. Now, you can halve a proportion in two ways. You can halve it by halving the numerator, or you can halve it by doubling the denominator. Or you can do something in between, a mix of the two, right? So what this reformulation means is that now that we have a rising numerator, which all by itself reduces the ratio, less work needs to be done in the numerator. So compare the 1996 World Food Summit promise with the Millennium Declaration, and you find that it's less ambitious. Why? Because world population between 2000 and 2015 is expected to increase by 20% to 120% of what it was, which means that the number of poor has to be reduced only to 60% of what it was in order to halve the proportion, 60% over 120. So a 40% reduction suffices. Now, with the first Millennium Development Goal, it's even better because we have a longer period from 1990 to 2015 for that growth of population to take place. And also because the MDGs are formulated not in terms of world population, but in terms of the population of the developing countries. The growth of the developing world population is expected to be 46% between 1990 and 2015. So it goes from 100% up to 146. That means that a reduction to 73% of the number of poor people suffices to halve the proportion, which means a 27% reduction in the number of poor people from the 1990 level suffices to fulfill MDG 1. So a 50% reduction from the 1996 level was turned into a 27% reduction from the 1990 level. Here is the result with the latest current numbers that the World Bank is putting out. And you can see here 3 different promises, and each of them correlated with the maximum permissible number of extremely poor people in the year 2015. So had we stuck to the World Food Summit promise, that number would have been 828 million. The Millennium Declaration raised that number to 999 million, And MDG 1 finally raised it again to 1,324 million. So roughly 500 million additional people were added to the rolls of those whose extreme poverty in 2015 is deemed morally permissible through these rather clever reformulations of our promise. What does that mean in practice? 500 million poor people? Well, it means about 6 million extra deaths annually. So 6 million additional poverty-related deaths will happen 2015 and beyond, because we didn't stick to the Rome promise, but rather diluted it twice in the Millennium Declaration and again in the MDGs. So this much, if you thought that we are very gung-ho and doing a lot of good work towards poverty reduction, it's not exactly true. Now, there's one other thing that is worth looking at. That is that when people think about poverty, and this very severe poverty that we're here talking about, it happens abroad. It doesn't, with that severity, happen in the United States. And we think that, well, maybe we ought to be doing more than we are doing to reduce it, to help, to assist, and have to find ways of doing that and so on. Now, here's one other problem. That is that we are not really only related to the global poverty problem as potential helpers, but also as contributors through our government. The global poverty problem is aggravated not only by earthquakes and floods and so on, but also by the global institutional arrangements under which both rich and poor countries exist and interact with each other. It's not a coincidence, I think, that we like to pay attention to poverty exactly in those situations like now in Haiti, where there is a clearly identifiable villain who certainly isn't us. I'm sure I didn't cause that earthquake. I'm absolutely certain. So I can look. I can accept that they're poor people, that they're desperate, and I can open my wallet and give and feel generous. But we don't look closely the other times when it's not so clear what causes poverty. And of course, even in this case, in Haiti now, surely there wouldn't have been 150,000 deaths if Haiti had been a little wealthier and the buildings a little better built and the emergency services in better shape and so on. Of course, poverty contributed even here very greatly to the death toll. A similar quake in Japan would barely cause a lot of deaths, maybe a few hundred if it were as strong, or in the United States for that matter. So here are some of the factors that I think are important contributors to the persistence of poverty in many poor countries. And you can see that these factors fall into two categories. Namely, they're factors that have their effect indirectly through the national institutional arrangements of poor countries. They essentially breed corruption, oppression, bad governance. And then you have also factors that work directly. And some of those factors are well known to you, and I don't have to go through them in great depth. So protectionism is a very obvious thing. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, was supposed to be a big market opening, but really we grandfathered in various permissions to protect our markets through anti-dumping duties, tariffs, quotas, export subsidies, and the subsidies are the most grotesque of all. We are still paying between $300 and $350 billion annually in export subsidies in agriculture alone. That's all rich countries together. We are subsidizing cotton, for example. The Europeans are subsidizing sugar and other things. And so thereby, we make it impossible for poor countries to import stuff into our country, and we make it also impossible for them to export the stuff at all, because we undersell them in world markets, and so take away their fair chance to take advantage of their lower labor costs for exports. Pollution rules is another thing. We benefit a lot from polluting activities. Poor people don't benefit and essentially suffer, are much less able to protect themselves than we are. Pharmaceuticals I'll talk about a lot in what follows, but let me say briefly something about those four privileges, which are a deeply entrenched rule in our global institutional order, according to which any person or group exercising effective power in a country can avail itself of the resources of that country, sell them, and can also borrow money in the name of the whole country. Now that's a rule that is very convenient for us because we can buy resources from anybody who happens to be in power in such a country. It's also very convenient for generals and colonels and people like that who are in a position to take power by force. But it is highly inconvenient, to put it mildly, for ordinary people in poor countries because they are the ones who are oppressed often by very bad governments, totally unelected, who oppress them with money and weapons that they get from us in exchange for resources that really belong to the people. Why should the fact that you drive your tanks, yours and your buddies, into the presidential palace entitle you to all the resources of the country and entitle you to sell them to the highest bidder in international markets, then convert the money partly into arms and partly into credits in the Swiss banking system, and with those weapons then to keep yourself in power and oppress the population whose resources these should really be. Anyway, that's just a side remark because many people look down their noses at people in poor countries and say, you know, we would never here in America allow ourselves to be governed by such dictators and jerks and so on. And the answer to this is they are just as opposed to their dictators as we would be, but they have no chance to dislodge them because these dictators are very heavily armed, very well financed, and they are that because we, on the outside, are recognizing them as entitled to sell the resources of the country and to borrow money that the whole country then has to repay. It's another thing where we can touch on Haiti, by the way. Haiti, for over 100 years, had a huge debt that it was gradually repaying, and that was a debt that it had taken out in order to repay reparations to France. It had to pay reparations to France. Why? Because the slaves had freed themselves. And so the French said, well, you freed yourselves illegally. You had no right to free yourselves. You were slaves. We owned you. So obviously, if you really want to keep your freedom, and they emphasized that with a heavy fleet sitting outside of Haiti's shores, if you want to retain your freedom, you just have to pay the price, what you were worth, and then you can buy your freedom. So they had to take out a huge loan, and that huge loan then was repaid over a long period until 1947. All right, so here is what I promised you earlier, namely a little bit of statistics about the world income distribution. And this is a study that was done again by the World Bank, a man called Branko Milanovic. And what I've done here is, or what he's done is convert everything in exchange rates so that you get a real sense of the magnitudes involved. And the analysis divides the world's population into ventiles. Ventiles are 20th of the world's population, so about 330, 340 million people each. And you go from the top down. You start with the richest and you go down to the poorest. And what you see here is that the richest ventile now, or in 2002, now certainly has well over half of all global household income. That's the income that is consumed by households. The top quarter has well over 90%, and the bottom half has under 3%. So there's an enormous income inequality in the world. The other thing that is worth looking at is how it developed over those 14 years of the globalization period from 88 to 2002. And there the interesting fact is that really only one ventile gained in share, increased its share. That was the top ventile. The top ventile added 6% of global household income to its share. So it went from 43 to 49%, whereas all the other ventiles lost. And you see in the bottom quarter, the loss, of course, though tiny in absolute terms, was very substantial in relative terms. That is to say, the share of the bottom quarter went down by over 20%, by over 1/5, from 1.16% to 0.92% of global household income. So there is a very strong trend of increasing inequality, but it's not that the upper half is rising and the lower half is losing, but it's really that the top 20th is rising and the bottom 19/20th are falling. So, and that's, by the way, not only true in the world, it's also true in the United States. It's a tremendous phenomenon in the US that a very, very small sliver of the population is increasing its share of US income. So the top 0.01% of taxpayers have a 7-fold increase in their share of US income between 1977 and 2007. So insofar as global institutional arrangements contribute to these poverty problems, the persistence of poverty in so many poor countries, that again is human rights relevant if you agree that human rights impose restraints not only on the conduct of individuals and collectives, but also on the rules that we impose on each other. So that, again, is a thought that isn't new with me, that is already in the Universal Declaration, where it says in Article 28 that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, including, of course, Article 25, can be fully realized. Good, so this was the first part. Now comes the second, and the good news is there is no third. So the second part is, what can we do about all this, right? I didn't come here to make you all sad. I came here to make you a little bit more active. So let's look at what can be done in the face of this problem. The problem is there. It's huge in human terms. It's small in economic terms. We could easily wipe it out if we chose to do so. But what we're actually doing is a lot of hot air rhetoric and very little action. How's this Texan saying? He's all hat and no land? Is that right? Okay. I like that one. So here it goes. We're all hat and no land when it comes to fighting poverty. All right. So here comes the idea. There are many ways of making the world better. The world is in such bad shape that every one of you can come up very quickly with good ideas about how to make things better. So that's not the hard part. The hard part is to decide which of these ideas we should put our weight behind. Because if we all pursue different ideas, 1 million good people pursuing 1 million good ideas, you can be damn sure that none of them will get off the ground. So what we need is to think carefully about which of these ideas are worth pursuing. And for that, we need criteria. We need a way of judging which of these reform ideas are the best. So here are 6 criteria that may help us sort through all the different ways of making the world better. One is that I think we should look for something that is an enduring structural reform. We shouldn't spend a lot of time and effort doing something that gives us a flash in the pan, so to speak, a one-time improvement that has to be fought over again and again in future years, or else will just evaporate. Second, we want a reform that symbolizes the idea that all human beings are of value and of equal value. Third, we want an idea that doesn't go against the strong preferences of the entire ruling class or elite of the rich and mighty worldwide. We want something where we have at least some natural allies among those who are powerful. Fourthly, we want something that can start small and can be scaled up so that we can learn from trying it out on a small scale. And then if something fails, we can correct it before we make it larger, rather than start very large and then maybe have a spectacular failure that frustrates the hopes for change for a long time to come. Fifth, we want a reform that is fertile in the sense that it opens avenues for further reforms in the future. For example, by strengthening those who have an objective interest in reform, giving the poor more of a voice, more of a say in politics. And finally, we want something that is an exemplar of moral leadership that gives us a case that can maybe be copied or reused in other contexts. That's again another aspect of fertility. So what I want to propose to you as satisfying these 6 criteria to a pretty large extent is a reform in the area of pharmaceuticals. And in order to motivate that, I'll tell you a few background tidbits about the pharmaceutical business. The first thing is there was a revolution in pharmaceuticals and much else in the mid-90s. There was the World Trade Agreement, and a part of that agreement was the TRIPS agreement. TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, and it was a part of the World Trade Organization treaty that was pushed very, very hard by 4 industries. And without thinking, you will know what those 4 industries are, namely the IP-heavy ones: entertainment, software, pharmaceuticals, and agribusiness. So those were the 4 big industries that banded together and pushed very hard the Clinton administration and also the European countries, which then in turn pushed very hard at the negotiations in the Uruguay round to have very strong intellectual property rights globalized. So no longer would there be weak or non-existent intellectual property protections in poor countries. There would be very strong protections and very strong enforcement. That's part and parcel of the WTO agreement. The minimum standard now is 20-year monopoly patents on medicines. So if you want to be a member of the WTO, you have to grant innovators, anyone who asks for it, patents for 20 years on their products. Now that system of monopoly protection for 20 years that counts from the time a patent is filed, so the effective patent period is shorter, is about 14 years or so. If you look at that system, you find that it has 7 important flaws, 7 important drawbacks, which I will quickly run through. The first is that high prices, and these high prices often are 30 to 60 times the cost of production. So if a pill costs 2 cents to produce per pill, the price can easily be $1.20 per pill. So that very high markup means that poor people are excluded so long as the medicine is under patent. Only when the medicine goes off patent is there any chance that competition among generic companies brings the price down and makes the medicine accessible to poor people. Now, why is the price so high? This again has to do with what I showed you earlier, namely the enormous inequality in the world in terms of economics. So with important medicines, the demand curve, how much people are willing to pay, is pretty much identical with the income curve. Because if I'm really sick and dying, I spend my bottom penny if I have to in order to get the medicine that can save me. So you have a very unequal demand curve here. I hope you're all familiar with basic economics. So the blue line, the blue dots there, are the cost curve. That's how much it costs to produce a certain quantity of medicine. The demand curve tells you how much demand there will be for the medicine at different prices. What the innovator will try to do, the monopolist will try to do, is choose a price on the vertical axis of that diagram in a way that maximizes the rectangle. And the rectangle is starting from that price point, goes to the right, to the red curve, then vertically down to the cost curve, and then on the cost curve to the left, back to the y-axis. So we are trying to maximize that rectangle because that rectangle is the profit. It's the markup multiplied by the sales volume, right? Is that clear? And depending on how this curve is shaped, the monopolist will simply choose the optimal price. So if a demand curve is very unevenly shaped like this one is, then it's worthwhile for the innovator to raise the price a lot because the number of customers that they lose is relatively small and the extra gain they get from charging the remaining customers more is greater. So it's not worth pricing into the right-hand corner because there isn't much profit to be made, and it's very much worth it to price towards the top corner where at little cost in terms of sales volume, you can make a lot more money through the markup. Now, the same phenomenon also accounts for another problem with the existing system. That is that innovation efforts are focused very heavily on diseases of the rich. The previous diagram showed why. You can't make much money with a medicine for a disease that only poor people have. Because then you face a Hobson's choice. Either you have the usual high markup, 30, 40, 50-fold, in which case, sorry, you have no customers. or you price it so that poor people can actually afford it. In that case, however, you have a very small markup. So it's much more profitable for pharmaceutical companies to research hair loss than to research a tropical disease. The health impact would be much greater with a tropical disease, but with hair loss, you have paying customers out there who are willing to pay a lot of money to have their full head of hair restored. Good, so that's the second problem, and you can see here empirically how it works. You have, in fact, an enormous discrepancy of just the sort I described. It's often called in the literature the 10-90 problem, that 10% of all pharmaceutical research is focused on diseases that account for 90% of the global disease burden, and vice versa. 90% of research focused on diseases that account for only 10% of the global disease burden. Near the bottom, you can see some interesting stats. There are 1,556 new molecular entities that were approved as drugs between 75 and 04, 30-year period. And in that whole period, only 18 medicines for tropical diseases were cleared and 3 for tuberculosis. It's simply not lucrative for pharmaceutical companies to research these diseases. Let's quickly run through the other 5 problems. Number 3 is the bias towards maintenance drugs, and I mention that because that should concern you as well. Drugs can be roughly classified into 3 categories: those that expel a pathogen from your body, cure you; those that prevent it from entering your body, like a vaccine; and those that do neither, but keep you functioning and at better well-being. You feel better, you function better, and so on. And those are the maintenance drugs. Now, under the present scheme of rules, maintenance drugs are by far the most lucrative economically for pharmaceutical companies, because a person who doesn't die and doesn't get well is the ideal customer. That person comes back again and again and buys the next supply. You cannot charge as much for cures, and you certainly cannot charge as much for vaccines, because vaccines are generally bought by very large buyers, such as governments or UNICEF or something like that, and those guys haggle over the price, which you can't do as an individual in the pharmacy. So that bias towards maintenance drugs should concern us, that pharmaceutical executives, if they really act in the best interest of shareholders, as they should, will focus on those medicines that are promising maintenance drugs at the expense of the other 2. The 4th problem is that the present system is extremely wasteful. One bit of waste is the cost of patenting medicines in all these different countries. The second is the endless litigation between brand name innovators and generic companies. So brand name innovators take out a lot of patents on any one medicine, not just one patent per medicine, but often many patents. Lipitor has 19 in Canada alone, for example. So there are many different patents, and there are these generic companies who want to get in on the act as early as possible. The brand name companies want to extend their patents as long as possible, so there are endless lawsuits. And ultimately, of course, our health system is paying for these lawsuits. And if you ask yourself, why do we have 16% of our gross national income devoted to healthcare, here's part of the answer. The third bit of waste is deadweight losses, which I'll explain on the next diagram. I leave this in abeyance for the moment. Another problem, number 5, is the cost, again, arises from the cost-price differential. The big gap between the cost of production and the price of the product is counterfeiting, a big problem in the poor countries, where when pills come on the market there that cost $2.50 per pill, then obviously some clever guy is going to say, hey, I can make a pill that looks just like it for 3 or 4 cents. And I'll sell it as a fake, but I sell it as the real thing, and people won't know the difference, and so on. Now, that's bad, of course, because people get cheated, but it's worst when, as often happens, these counterfeiters put a little active ingredient into the drug. So they often take a pill and then stretch it over 5 or 10 pills that are lookalikes and sell it on the streets. That's bad, because that way resistance builds up. The people who take the medicine get enough medicine to kill off the weakest pathogens, but the stronger ones survive, and so a resistant strain of the disease quickly emerges. And that makes the whole drug useless much quicker than it would otherwise have become. The sixth problem is excessive marketing. That's again mainly a problem in rich countries and actually mainly in the United States, where advertising for medicines is permitted. You have a huge army of people, young and handsome boys and girls out there chasing doctors, trying to entice them to prescribe this medicine rather than that medicine. And doctors get all sorts of gifts and trips and get invited to congresses to give important lectures in Hawaii and so on and so forth, in order to entice them to prefer a particular product over others. That should worry you, because really what you want as patients is that the doctor looks at you and gives you the drug that's best suited to your condition, rather than that the doctor is sidetracked by thinking about the next trip to Hawaii. Finally, there's the last mile problem, which is a problem that you may think doesn't belong on this list. The last mile problem is a well-known problem that poor countries have very lousy health infrastructure, not enough doctors, not enough nurses, not enough refrigerators, not enough hospitals, not enough this and that, diagnostic equipment and so on. And that is a great obstacle to getting them properly provisioned with healthcare, poor people who live there. Now it belongs on the list, I think, for the following reason, that pharmaceutical companies, as things are now, not only have no interest in addressing these needs, but actually have an interest in leaving things as they are. Because poor people, as we've already said, are irrelevant as customers. They're not relevant. They don't have the money to buy our pills, but they have one use. And the one use they have is that they keep certain diseases alive that might otherwise die out. So whenever I travel in the developing world, I buy myself a pack of Malarone and take them to protect myself against malaria. Why do I do that? Because I know malaria is rampant there. And I wouldn't be doing that. I wouldn't be profitable to the producers of Malarone if it weren't the case that there are poor people in poor countries who continue to suffer from malaria. So that's, again, a disadvantage of the present system. Pharmaceutical companies have no incentive to address the great health needs of the poor. If anything, an incentive not to. So here's the solution that I am working on, the Health Impact Fund. And this solution has to fulfill one additional condition, namely that it has to allow pharmaceutical innovators to get their money's worth. It's very expensive to innovate, partly because stage 3 clinical trials are very expensive, but partly also because many innovation ideas fail somewhere along the way. And so the successful drugs have to pay the cost that was invested in the unsuccessful ones as well as the ones that succeed. So that has to be all paid for. And so we have to find a way of regulating the pharmaceutical industry so that they can innovate and recapture somehow the money that they invest in pharmaceutical innovation. I should say here, by the way, that what I said earlier, it may have sounded to some of you as a tirade against the pharmaceutical industry, but it wasn't meant to be that. I think the pharmaceutical industry is behaving like any other industry is behaving. It's following incentives, it's doing what's profitable, it's fulfilling its responsibilities to its shareholders. And the responsibility that I see with us. We are the citizens of this country. We and our politicians are designing the rules under which the pharmaceutical companies are operating. And these rules are singularly badly designed for the various reasons that I mentioned. So we have the responsibility to look for a better design of these rules. So here's how the Health Impact Fund would work. It would be a parallel track on which pharmaceutical innovators can be rewarded for their innovations. And the reward would happen through annual reward pools that willing governments would provide into the indefinite future. So governments would together fund a permanent source of pharmaceutical innovation. Initially, we think with something like $6 billion per year. So each year there would be a pool of $6 billion available to reward pharmaceutical innovation. And innovators who register their product would have 10 years on the Health Impact Fund track. For 10 years, they would participate in these annual $6 billion pools. Registration is voluntary. That's politically a very important part of this proposal. So innovators can choose with regard to each and every one of their products whether to register or not. If they register, they get an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage I've already mentioned, they get a share of the pool for 10 years. And that share will be proportioned to the health impact that their medicine achieved. So if all the registered medicines together achieved a certain health impact, and your medicine achieved 8% of that, then you get 8% of the pool for that particular year. So basically each pool gets divided up in proportion to the health impact fund of registered innovators in the relevant year. So that's the advantage of registering. The disadvantage is that by registering, you renounce any profit from sales that you might get. So you promise to sell your product at the lowest feasible cost of production and distribution. You make no money at all by marking up your product. Now, let me go through a few of the details of the proposal, and then most of them I will leave for you to ask about and to discuss in a bit, but let me say a few things that might be worth knowing. The first thing you will want to know is what's the metric? How do we assess health impact? And here we already have a very good metric that's been introduced 20 years ago by Chris Murray and his collaborators. He's now at the Gates-funded Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation and works with us on making the Health Impact Fund specific. So the QALY is a unit that basically counts 1 year of healthy life added to somebody's life as one QALY. And then if that year is less healthy, it is correspondingly less than one QALY. And also if a person who is living an extra year anyway, but is living in better health during that additional year, that can also be cashed out as QALY. So you can think of each life as being, let's say, 80 units long, 80 years long. And if it is fully healthy, it would produce a full 80 QALYs. But if the person dies before they reach age 80, then something is nibbled off at the end of this plank, so to speak. And if the person is unhealthy at any time during his or her life, then something is nibbled off at the top of that plank. I hope that's sort of intuitively clear. Now, diseases do that. They nibble off bits and pieces of these nice 80 QALY planks. But medicines, in turn, restore that. Medicines reduce the reduction that diseases affect on these planks. And so we reward medicines in proportion to the QALYs whose loss through disease they avert. One great advantage of the Health Impact Fund is that it also incentivizes innovators to try to overcome the last mile problem. So innovators benefit more if they can find more patients who actually get helped by the drug. It's not a matter of selling a lot of units of the drug. It's a matter of making the drug optimally effective for those who actually need it. So in that sense, it does the opposite of the present system. It incentivizes pharmaceutical firms to try to overcome the last mile problems in poor countries, to help with diagnostic equipment, with refrigerators, with hospitals and so on. Anything that gives my drug a greater health impact in the world will be rewarded. Financing. $6 billion is a very small amount of money. It's about 0.01% of global income. And we don't need each and every government to participate. And I'm sure that some governments, including this one, will not be among the first to participate. But if we get, let's say, governments representing a third of global income to participate, then we need to ask each of them for only 0.03% of their gross national incomes, and we'll have the right 6 billion amount. It's important here, and that's one great difficulty, to get governments to commit long-term, because if we want pharmaceutical companies to take the incentive seriously and to start a research project now, then we have to give them assurance that the money is actually going to be there after 2020 when their reward period begins. This financing, these $6 billion, most of that money actually comes back to the consumers of the world through savings. You're paying something through the tax system, but you're also gaining something by paying less money for the Health Impact Fund sponsored drugs. So this diagram shows this quite nicely. You can see here, this is the standard picture when drugs are priced under the monopoly system. You have a very large producer surplus, which is the markup multiplied by the sales volume, which we discussed before. You have a consumer surplus, which is where consumers who are rich buy the product at a price that is actually cheaper than what they would have been prepared to pay. So I would have been prepared to pay even more than what these expensive medicines now cost. And on the right-hand side is the deadweight loss. That is the loss that occurs, the economic loss to the world, that arises from many mutually advantageous transactions between sellers and buyers being prevented by the high markup. So if the drug is sold at $100, for example, and is produced for 10, then there are lots of customers out there who would be willing to pay 80 or 60, but they never buy the product. And this means a loss for the pair, namely the potential buyer and the seller, because the seller would, even at $80 or $60, still make a very good profit. But they can't go ahead and sell the medicine at a lower price because they would thereby undermine their own monopoly price. So the deadweight loss is the loss of mutually advantageous transactions between buyers and sellers between the monopoly price and the cost of production. If we now introduce the Health Impact Fund, or rather move a drug from this system to the Health Impact Fund system, then the price of the drug will be equal to the cost. So this will be the point at which the drug will be priced. So you shift this over to the y-axis, and everything above, all the way to the demand curve, will now be consumer surplus. So the consumers get the old consumer surplus, the deadweight loss, the producer surplus, and the additional benefit from economies of scale, which means lower cost at higher volumes. To be sure, the consumers have to pay the producers enough to lure them over to the Health Impact Fund track, but given the gains that they make from deadweight losses being avoided and from the economies of scale, they can easily pay the producers enough to make them come out even or even better, and still do better themselves. So collectively, the world's consumers or patients do much better under this system than they do under the existing system. So in other words, the system pays for itself. Not, to be sure, for each and every one of you. So if you are Bill Gates, for example, you cannot possibly be sick enough long enough to get back in terms of cheap health impact funded drugs all the money that you paid in extra taxes. If you are always healthy, you will be a loser relative to the existing system. But consumers at large, human beings at large, will be winners. And that's the most important point. Good. I think I'll stop here because I'm a bit out of time and look forward to your questions, comments, objections, expressions of outrage, and other reactions.
Questions, comments? Yes? The male here first, and then his neighbor.
I was wondering if two companies are, like, let's say two pharmaceutical companies are both considering developing products to reduce malaria, for instance, the incentive for one company to research the product would be less if it knows that there would be another competitor willing to eat into its global health impact. So can you help outline how this fund would help alleviate that? Do you see what I'm like?
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying. And that's, of course, a problem that we have now, right? The present system is exactly the same problem, namely that there could be two different hair loss products or two different whatever products that are competing with each other, and if somebody else is working on the same disease as I am, then there is that problem that they will capture some of the market. So there's no particular solution in the Health Impact Fund scheme to this particular problem. So what will happen is exactly what happens now. These companies will try to figure out what other companies are researching, and they will take the likelihood of other companies succeeding into account in their own research projects. So this goes back to a more general issue, namely the issue of whether you get the best results in innovation through push funding or pull funding. With pull funding is funding where you say, I give no money now, I give money only to those who actually achieve something. So you pay for performance, if you like. Pull funding has the advantage that it leads to much more serious efforts to work out a solution than push funding, where you go to somebody and say, look, I want to give you $400 million and I want you to work on this problem. There the person already has the money and is much less motivated really to do very good work to try to solve the problem. But with push funding, you do have the advantage that you avoid duplication of effort. You basically give the money to one person or group, whoever you identify as the most promising, and then hope for the best. So the Health Impact Fund, just like the existing patent system, is a pull mechanism, something that puts money at the end of the pipeline, and then has the advantage of inspiring greater efforts, but the disadvantage of also inspiring some duplication, which, by the way, in some contexts is an advantage because you don't know ahead of time that these different avenues that different companies are exploring will all succeed. Sometimes they do, but sometimes it's very good that two different avenues were tried simultaneously because the one team hits a dead end and the other one is succeeding, and had you only funded one, you might have hit only the dead end.
For the medications that would go through and be approved by the HIF, would these also require FDA approval, even though they're probably not being used in the United States?
Yes, they would. And the thing is, it's very important that these medicines be safe and effective and that they have serious approval, not just from Rwanda or some approval agency that isn't really competent, but from a competent agency. So we want to say that they have to get market clearance from one of a small handful of really competent agencies that can assess the medicine. Nothing would be worse for the future of the Health Impact Fund if one of the first drugs it allowed to register were a drug that has disastrous health side effects and so on. So we want to make very sure that these drugs are safe and effective. The other thing is that when you said that these would be drugs for developing countries, that's unclear because the Health Impact Fund is accepting registrations of any drug. So it's likely that, at least in the initial years, the greatest gains from the health impact rewards can be harvested through the traditionally neglected diseases, such as tropical diseases and so on. And so chances are that they will be overrepresented at the beginning. But in the long run, who knows what diseases? It will certainly be the most potent, the most effective remedies that will be registered because that's where the health impact reward can be harvested. One other thing is, of course, if I can say one more sentence, that in the developing world now, the disease burden distribution is becoming more and more similar to the disease burden distribution in rich countries. And so this great gap between what they are suffering from and what we are suffering from is shrinking, and that shrinkage would be accelerated by the Health Impact Fund.
First over here, and then we have... Go ahead.
Would the Health Impact Fund be constructed as a separate entity from other international funding agencies, or would it be a subset of the IMF?
Of the IMF? No, not of the IMF. We are talking with two different parties. I've yesterday talked with the World Bank, and they were very, very positive. They really want that thing. If it gets up, they want it to be a World Bank thing. And I've also talked with the Global Fund about it. The Global Fund is a fund specializing now on only 3 diseases, AIDS, TB, and malaria. But they want to branch out and include other diseases and also want to do more research. The advantage of putting oneself under the wings of an existing agency that works pretty well it's obvious that governments, in thinking about funding this, will not say, well, do we really want to give $6 billion to this philosopher? So it's much better to tell them it's actually going to be the World Bank is going to look after me and so on. So and we would be a pretty self-contained and independent agency sitting under and being administered by either the World Bank or the Global Fund. That would be my preference. I don't think the IMF would be the right vehicle.
Go ahead.
I can understand the morality of the unit, the quali, but I'm not sure I understand the economic basis of it. Planetary equality of the quali significance in economic terms.
Yeah, so is your objection perhaps that even though, if we give equal weight to the qualities of everybody and say that improving the health of a poor person counts as much as improving the health of a rich person, we are overlooking the fact that the rich person contributes much more to the economy?
Well, in some societies, even given an improvement of health, there may not be the opportunity for it to be expressed in productivity.
Right, that's right, sure. That's right. So the Health Impact Fund leaves that out of account. It does, as you rightly surmise, it just looks at the improvement of the health of these patients, regardless of whether this better health will be convertible into greater economic productivity. And the rationale for doing that is the Health Impact Fund is basically a mechanism that's complementary to the existing system. Under the existing system, wealthy people still have every opportunity to get better health care than poor people. The Health Impact Fund just provides a certain bunch of very important essential medicines at cost to everyone, and then leaves the rest of the health system as it is now, with special treatment for those with a lot of money. Yeah, that's right. So it's a complement. It's not supposed to be a system that to which the whole health system then converts or something, but it's a complement to the existing system. And in that complement, the health of all people is valued equally.
Marty?
So a question about, as you mentioned, there's significant or great costs associated with research and development for new drugs. And I'm wondering whether you have a sense for how those costs can be weighed against the incentives that companies will have to take part in this plan, because it could still be, even a certain slice of this $6 billion might not be enough of an incentive for them to direct their energies in that way. They could just go for another, impotence drug or whatever that will be more profitable. So, how much of an incentive do you anticipate them having?
Yeah. This is actually one of the ingenious things about the Health Impact Fund, that there's a really good answer to your question. Here's how it goes. How many drugs will register? Well, that depends on how much profit these companies will expect and will need to make in order to make it worth their while to develop a new medicine. Now, suppose that your worry comes to pass, so that there are too many drugs registered, the reward rate becomes low, the whole thing becomes unattractive. What will happen? Well, what will happen is that all innovators who have a choice, who can do reasonably well on the patent track as well, they'll stay away. They'll say, this is not attractive, this is not interesting for us. And so they will shift over, or they will not even shift, they will just not register in the first place. They'll just say, I will stay away, I'm not interested, that's it. The result will be that the reward rate will rise because there will be fewer registrations. Conversely, if the reward rate is very rich and attractive, then those innovators who have a choice will say, well, under those conditions, I will register my product with the Health Impact Fund and make more money there. So the reward rate will adjust itself at a reasonable level. It must be a level that innovators find profitable, because if it were lower than that, it would rise. So we will learn over time what it really costs innovators to innovate, and also innovators can rely on the rationality of one another. So if I register my product, I don't have to be afraid that the rate will drop and drop and drop over my 10-year reward period. I know that my competitors, all the other people in the business, they're not idiots. They will not register if the rate falls too low. And so I can count on lows being temporary and the rate be recovering if it ever sinks too low. So it's a self-adjusting mechanism. We don't know ahead of time how many products we'll get for our $6 billion. We reckon roughly 2 per annum, or 20 at any given time, will be on the Health Impact Fund at $6 billion. But however many they will be, time will tell.
Do you see a challenge to the distribution of drugs that are successful through research getting to the population they're intended for? I have some concerns, especially in these countries that already have problems with distribution and care for their indigent population. How would that get to them, and is there a likelihood that there may be some other incentives for those governments to hoard drug or mark up prices and those types of issues coming into the play?
Yeah. These are enormously complicated issues which we have to deal with to see what kind of perverse incentives there might be, what ways of gaming the system, and so on. But the very basic idea is this. First of all, it's clear that there are countries now where the Health Impact Fund cannot do any good. Like North Korea, for example, there's a madman in power, and if this guy says we don't want these drugs to come in, then these drugs won't come in, and there's nothing much we can do about it short of going to war, which with North Korea we certainly don't want to do. So that's granted. Now, the next thing is that the rewards that we pay, that the Health Impact Fund pays, will shift the incentives of the pharmaceutical companies in the direction of trying to overcome last mile problems. And so the basic idea is to say that pharmaceutical companies haven't done much for developing country health, and certainly very little for overcoming last mile problems. But the reason for that is not that they can't, but that they haven't been incentivized. It hasn't been worth their while. It would have been irresponsible towards their shareholders to actually spend a lot of money doing this. Now, once they get paid for health impact, then many things become profitable for them to do. For example, if it turns out that refrigeration is lacking and my medicine spoils in many African countries, then it becomes profitable for me to look around for other pharmaceutical companies with a similar problem and to start sponsoring maybe an NGO or whatever effort to bring refrigerators to those countries so that the medicine can be kept fresh. And so on for diagnostic equipment and other things. So pharmaceutical companies will make exactly those efforts that they can profitably make, where the extra gain of health impact will be large enough, or the reward for it, large enough to pay for the effort, and other efforts they will leave aside. They will not, for example, try to bring the medicine to the remotest mountain village in particular countries, because that just is too expensive. The health impact that would be achieved would be too small relative to the cost of doing it. But certainly they will find innovative ways to work together with local health systems, with NGOs and so on and so forth, to solve those last mile problems that they can solve relatively cost effectively. And that's, if I can say one more thing, if you look at what's always surprising to me is to find UPS and Coca-Cola and so on in the most remote corners of the world, right? You can get ice-cold Coca-Cola at some tourist spot in the Andes and so on, and UPS gets the parcel there at some reasonable price. So companies are incredibly good at figuring things out, but only if they have a profit motive to do so. So that's the underlying idea here.
Casey?
This is sort of a follow-up to the last question, but are the only incentives for developing these solutions to these last-mile problems by way of the first-order drug incentives? So, for example, I invent some really fantastic method for delivering drugs that all of these companies could use, which would certainly raise the qualities. Is there some additional incentive for that? Or is it going to... The worry is that it would run through these kind of proprietary pharmaceutical company-specific incentives with respect.
Yeah, so there isn't, the way it's now designed, there isn't such an additional incentive. But of course, if you had something like that, and if it were patentable, for example, then you could offer it to pharmaceutical companies, and they could then buy it from you if they felt that the cost is worth, the extra health impact they could achieve is worth the cost of buying it off you. So the idea really is to put a large incentive out at the very, very end of the pipeline. What we really want to achieve is health improvement for poor people, or for people in general, and then to leave everything in between to companies to sort out. on the assumption that companies, if properly incentivized, have the inventiveness and also the ability to combine their efforts with the efforts of others to solve these kinds of problems in between. So it would be nice to sort of add other innovative efforts into this, but so far the only thing that we have been able to do in a way that is reasonably hard and fast and can be measured reasonably well and so on is actually medicines.
I think you said during your talk that you came here to make us somewhat more active. So I was wondering, what was it you wanted to encourage us to do?
Well, I mean, that it is always difficult to answer that question in the abstract, because I think what each of us can most reasonably do depends to a large extent on what we can do, sort of what our special abilities are and so on, and also on which position we occupy in the world, where we sit in the world, and so what our special opportunities are and options are, and so on and so forth. But in general, I mean, how about supporting the Health Impact Fund? That would be one good thing you could do, or maybe working out some of the problems that we are facing in specifying the Health Impact Fund, and more generally, just thinking about the global poverty problem and the health burdens that it generates in a way that is constructive, and thinks about what other good ideas are there about how one can improve that problem in a way that isn't too burdensome on the powers that be.
I have a question in the back.
Yes, you may have addressed this question, but I'm curious about how many countries do you think it would take? I'm assuming the requirement would be $6 billion per year per country. Is that right?
No, $6 billion per year.
Just total.
For all countries.
Yeah.
Oh, so that would be
so
just one sum total of $6 billion.
Yeah.
And that's it.
That's it.
Okay. Also, when the issue of drug approval was raised and the FDA was mentioned, would you leave it to whatever agency in whatever country the drug manufacturer exists to provide approval, or would you anticipate establishing some sort of unified approval process for all drugs?
No, we would envisage that the approval process stays pretty much the way it is, that you need approval in the various countries in order to market the medicine there. The one problem that we have to solve is the problem that innovators will sometimes have an incentive not to try to get approval. The reason is that they might have a second product that is not Health Impact Fund registered, that does more or less the same thing, and they want that second high-priced product to be the only one available in which countries. That we have to prevent, because you, taxpayers in the United States, for example, would be rightly outraged if you funded a scheme that produces this cheap drug, if then that cheap drug were not available in the United States as well. So here, the innovator has to commit, as part of the registration process, that they will make a serious effort to register the drug in all countries, and if they don't make good progress with that, they have to pre-authorize the Health Impact Fund to make that effort in their behalf. So if the Health Impact Fund finds that a particular drug company isn't making an effort to register its product in Europe or in the United States, then the Health Impact Fund is authorized to step in and seek registration, seek market clearance by the FDA in this case.
Okay, I was just curious if there would be an incentive perhaps for certain companies to maybe move locations to seek approval from different drug approval organizations.
Yeah, I don't think moving locations will do anything for you. You need approval from the agency that is in charge of the jurisdiction in which you want to market your medicine. It doesn't matter where you yourself are located. And that's something that normally works automatically for most of the poor countries. So the poor countries take their clues from the Europeans, from the Americans, so most of them don't have the capacity to seriously assess a new medicine. So they look and they see it's being approved by the FDA, so we will also approve it. Or the WHO will signal, this is a serious drug, you should be approving it, and then many countries will approve it.
One last question, perhaps?
It's to
early to ask this, but you mentioned the first half of your talk that the Chinese had that huge reduction in poverty. Have you written anything about how they achieved that and what the health impact of that reduction in poverty has been for that group of the Chinese people?
Yeah, no, I haven't. I don't really know the details well enough to write on that topic. One thing I have written about is the enormous increase in inequality in China that went along with that particular poverty reduction. So what you have is a enormous shrinkage in the share of the bottom half, the bottom quarter of the population, even though they have gone up with the exploding economy that's grown at 6-7% per annum in real terms in GNP per capita. Nonetheless, they have grown at a much lower rate than the top of the population.
Let's thank our speakers.